The nose lowers first, almost like a bow on the runway. Concorde does not look like a conventional airliner preparing for takeoff. It looks like a blade, long and narrow and improbably elegant, with a drooping beak that gives the pilots visibility as the aircraft taxis and then rises to meet the sky. Inside the cabin, the seats are close together, the windows are small, and the space is narrower than the romance around it would suggest. And then the engines come alive. The afterburners flare, the airframe shudders, and the whole aircraft seems to tense before it leaps forward with a force that is less like departure than release. For the passengers who were lucky enough to board it, Concorde made the Atlantic feel small in a way that still sounds unreal. It was not a theoretical promise or a prototype in a museum. It was a scheduled passenger aircraft, carrying about 100 people, climbing to around 60,000 feet, and cruising at roughly Mach 2, more than 1,300 miles an hour. On the London to New York run, it could cut the journey to a little over 3 hours. For a certain kind of traveler, that did not just save time. It changed the emotional scale of distance itself. Paris, London, and New York no longer felt like separate worlds divided by an ocean. They felt like appointments. That was the seduction of Concorde. Not only speed, but the feeling that speed had become civilized. This was travel with champagne, white gloves, and a horizon that arrived before you had time to think about it. To fly Concorde was to buy a story as much as a seat. It was an encounter with a future that seemed to have skipped past every compromise the rest of aviation had accepted. The aircraft was sleek, quiet enough inside to converse, and glamorous in the way only a machine can be when it appears to have beaten physics without looking reckless. And yet the paradox was visible even in the experience of boarding it. Concorde was extraordinary precisely because it was so unlike the aircraft around it. The cabin was compact, the payload was limited, the operating procedures were specialized. Every flight demanded intense maintenance, unusual attention, and a highly choreographed system on the ground as well as in the air. This was not an airplane designed to be everywhere. It was designed to be exceptional. In that sense, the machine embodied its own contradiction. It was the future, but only for a few. The public came to know Concorde as an icon, but icons can hide their own fragility. What looked like a revolution was also a compromise, one built around prestige, performance, and national pride as much as around commercial logic. The airplane's fame grew because it was real. People could watch it rise, hear it thunder, read the headlines, and see its silver shape crossing the world's most glamorous routes. But fame is not the same as scalability. Concorde worked brilliantly in the narrow space it was given. The larger question was whether that space had ever been wide enough for the future it promised. That question is the heart of this story. Because Concorde was not a fantasy, and it was not a failure in the simple sense either. It flew passengers for decades. It became one of the most recognizable machines ever built. It delivered exactly what it advertised: speed, prestige, and a transatlantic crossing compressed into something that felt almost impossible. But it never became the template for aviation's next age. The aircraft that seemed to erase distance did not, in the end, reshape the industry. For years, it survived as a kind of airborne exception, a luxury product in a world that was moving in the opposite direction. Commercial aviation was getting larger, cheaper, and more democratic. Concorde was getting older, more expensive, and more constrained. Its route network was limited by noise restrictions and the realities of sonic booms. Its tiny cabin and specialized systems made it a marvel, but not a mass-market machine. What passengers experienced as magic, airlines experienced as complexity. What the public saw as progress, the balance sheets saw as burden. And still, for all of that, Concorde endured long enough to define an era. British Airways and Air France operated it in regular service, and for a time, it became one of the most prestigious tickets in the world. That mattered. It meant the aircraft was not merely a paper promise or a museum piece before its time. It was a living service, a machine people organized their lives around, a machine that could carry dignitaries, executives, celebrities, and the merely determined across the Atlantic faster than any scheduled passenger aircraft before it. But the end was always waiting in the design itself, and in the economics around it, and in the changing world that had once celebrated its audacity. The crash in 2000 would wound Concorde deeply. Aging airframes, maintenance costs, route limits, and a global slowdown would all tighten the noose further. By the time the last British Airways Concorde landed on October 24, 2003, the future it had once represented had become a memory with a finish line. So the real question is not why Concorde was admired. That part is easy to understand the moment you picture it climbing, nose down, engines roaring, as the ocean falls away beneath the wings. The real question is why a machine so spectacular, so famous, and so undeniably real could still fail to become the normal shape of the future. To answer that, we have to go back before the airplane itself, to the moment when speed became a national dream, when governments still believed aviation could rewrite geography, and when Britain and France decided to build a symbol that would fly. Before Concorde was a shape in the sky, it was an argument about the future. The post-war world was full of machines that seemed to promise a new scale of life. Jet airliners had already begun to shrink the map, turning oceans into schedules and capitals into layovers. Military aviation was pushing higher, faster, and farther with every passing year, teaching engineers to think in terms that would have sounded like science fiction only a generation earlier. Speed was no longer just a matter of getting from one place to another. It had become a measure of national seriousness, a way for governments to announce that they still belonged among the technologically advanced powers of the age. In that atmosphere, the idea of supersonic passenger travel did not feel eccentric. It felt inevitable. If jets had conquered the Atlantic at subsonic speed, then the next question was obvious. Why stop there? Why should civilians not travel at the velocities already being pursued in military programs and experimental aircraft? The fantasy was seductive because it seemed to follow the logic of progress itself. Every decade had moved faster than the one before. Every technical barrier that had once looked permanent had turned out to be temporary. The future, in the mid-20th century, was supposed to arrive by acceleration. For Britain and France, that dream carried a burden far beyond convenience. Neither country wanted merely to participate in the jet age. Both wanted to remain visible in it. In the years after the Second World War, aerospace power had become one of the clearest markers of industrial strength, scientific competence, and geopolitical relevance. To build a supersonic transport was to prove that a nation could still master difficult materials, complex aerodynamics, precision manufacturing, and the enormous coordination required to turn theory into a certified airline product. It was a prestige project, yes, but prestige in this era was never only decoration. It was a statement about whether a country could still shape the technological frontier rather than watch others define it. That is why the Anglo-French partnership mattered so much. The Concorde project was not simply a collaboration of convenience, it was a political act. The 1962 treaty between Britain and France formalized a commitment that made the aircraft more than a sketch, more than a conference room dream, more than a speculative paper design. Once the government signed on, the project acquired momentum that could not easily be reversed. The name itself was part of the message. Concorde suggested agreement, harmony, and partnership. It was a word chosen not just to describe an airplane, but to frame what the airplane meant. Two European nations, long separated by history and rivalry, deciding to build something monumental together. That symbolism was essential because the aircraft was always larger than transport alone. Concorde arrived at a time when Europe was still proving that it could act collectively in fields once dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War sharpened every technological contest, and supersonic flight belonged to that world of rivalry and demonstration. The airplane was not launched into a vacuum. It entered a global race in which speed, range, altitude, and sleekness all carried political weight. Supersonic transport was imagined not as a curiosity, but as a next step for civilization itself, a way of declaring that the age of distance was ending. And for a while, that future looked commercially plausible. Airlines showed interest. The prospect of crossing the Atlantic in a fraction of the usual time was powerful enough to make the project seem not merely romantic but practical, especially in an era when the prestige of a route could matter as much as its passenger volume. If enough carriers wanted it, then the machine might find its market. If enough wealthy travelers and business passengers valued time more than cost, then maybe supersonic travel would not remain an elite fantasy. The early enthusiasm mattered because it helped transform Concorde from an engineering ambition into an industry expectation. It suggested that the world might actually pay for the future once it arrived. But that expectation had a hidden consequence. The moment Britain and France committed themselves publicly, the dream stopped being optional. It became politically irreversible. To back away would have meant conceding not just an aircraft program, but a national and diplomatic vision. And once a project reaches that point, engineering decisions are no longer merely technical decisions. They become promises. Every pound and franc already spent makes the next pound and franc easier to justify. Every prototype, every conference, every ribbon cutting narrows the path to cancellation until the only direction left is forward. That was the dangerous beauty of Concorde before it existed. It was not yet a machine, so it could still be imagined as pure triumph. It had not yet had to answer to fuel bills, route maps, noise complaints, or the brutal arithmetic of operations. It stood at the intersection of confidence and aspiration, when governments still believed that if a problem was difficult enough, it was probably worthy of a national effort. In that sense, Concorde was born from a mid-century faith as much as from a treaty. The belief that engineering could outrun constraint, that prestige could justify expense, and that the world would eventually reward whoever arrived first. The airplane would soon discover that the future was more complicated than speed alone. To make Concorde real, engineers would have to negotiate with heat, drag, fuel, structure, and human comfort in ways that made the airplane look less like a miracle than a series of hard-won compromises. But that comes later. First came the dream, and the conviction that the dream deserved to be built. Once that conviction took hold, the impossible was already halfway to becoming ordinary. If the dream of Concorde began as politics and prestige, the next problem was brutally practical. How do you build a passenger airplane that can behave like three different machines at once? It had to rise and land like a conventional airliner, climb efficiently through the atmosphere, and then settle into sustained Mach 2 flight for hours without tearing itself apart. That was the true riddle. Not whether supersonic travel was imaginable, but whether it could be made routine, reliable, and safe enough to carry ordinary people across an ocean. Every major feature of Concorde grew out of that question. The shape of the fuselage was long and slender to reduce drag. The wing was not a normal swept wing, but a thin delta, broad at the root and tapering to a point, chosen because it could handle high-speed flight without the catastrophic penalties that would cripple a conventional design. Even that elegant triangle was not enough on its own. At low speeds, delta wings can be unforgiving, which meant Concorde had to solve one of aviation's oldest trade-offs. The same machine that needed to slice the air at supersonic speed also had to survive the slow, awkward business of takeoff and landing. That tension shaped almost everything else. Concorde's engines were buried in carefully managed nacelles with variable intakes, because at Mach 2, the air entering the engines had to be slowed and controlled before combustion could work properly. The Rolls-Royce and Snecma Olympus engines were not just powerful, they were part of a finely choreographed system in which the aircraft's speed, the airflow, and the engine all had to remain in conversation with one another. In a normal jet, the engines provide thrust, and the rest is largely a matter of keeping the airplane stable. In Concorde, the intake itself was a major aerodynamic device. The airplane was not merely flying through the air, it was shaping the air around it. Then there was the nose. The famous drooping front end was not a stylistic flourish, but a practical answer to a simple human problem. Pilots had to see the runway during taxi, takeoff, and landing. At supersonic cruise, the nose could be raised into a clean, streamlined position. On approach, it was lowered so the cockpit crew could see what they were doing. That visible hinge between two worlds became one of Concorde's most recognizable features, a piece of machinery that looked theatrical because it was born from necessity. The deeper the airplane went into the realm of speed, the more the environment itself became part of the machine. At Mach 2, the air rubbing against the skin of the aircraft generates heat, and not a little of it. Concorde's metal structure could not simply be strong, it had to tolerate temperature. The fuselage and wings warmed up in flight and expanded. Engineers had to account for that expansion in the way they designed joints, panels, and the overall airframe. This was not like building a faster version of a subsonic airliner. It was like building an instrument that would spend much of its life in a state of controlled thermal stress. The airplane was never just cold aluminum cutting through cold sky. It was a living balance of force and heat, pressure and expansion, speed and endurance. Fuel sat at the center of that balance. Concorde's range depended on fuel, but fuel also dictated the airplane's limits. The aircraft carried huge quantities of it, and the fuel was not only propellant but ballast, a tool used to manage balance as the center of gravity shifted during flight. In other words, fuel was both the reason the airplane could cross an ocean and one of the reasons it could not do much more. Every gallon added weight on takeoff. Every extra pound of structure demanded more lift, and every compromise to increase efficiency in one phase of flight could make another phase worse. The result was an airplane whose performance was extraordinary and whose freedom was narrow. Concorde could go very fast, but it could not ignore the arithmetic of mass, drag, and thrust. That arithmetic had consequences for what Concorde could carry and where it could go. Its cabin was small by wide-body standards, built for roughly 100 passengers, not the hundreds that defined modern long-haul economics. That was not an accident or an oversight. It was the price of speed, and it meant that the airplane's glamour was inseparable from its scarcity. Every seat had to be justified in a way that a larger jet could ignore. Range, payload, and fuel were locked in a permanent struggle. More fuel could extend the route, but only by stealing capacity from passengers or cargo. More payload could improve revenue, but only by limiting how far the aircraft could go. Concorde was a machine designed under pressure from every direction, and those pressures never disappeared. Because of that, operating Concorde was never as simple as putting a jet into service and letting a timetable absorb the rest. It demanded specialized crews, meticulous maintenance, and a level of technical attention that went far beyond what most airlines expected from a commercial aircraft. The airplane had to be treated as a precision system. Its structure, its engines, its hydraulic arrangements, its intake management, its temperature limits, and its operating procedures all required discipline. Concorde did not forgive casualness. It was not a plug-and-play asset. It was a high-performance machine that asked everyone around it to rise to its standards. And yet, for all its complexity, Concorde kept moving from theory toward fact. The first successful flight on March 20, 1969, transformed the project's status. The airplane was no longer just a diplomatic promise or an engineering argument. It existed. It lifted off, flew, and proved that the basic idea could survive contact with the sky. That matters because aviation history is full of beautiful plans that fail in the air, where paper logic meets reality. Concorde passed that test. The impossible was no longer hypothetical. But proving that something can fly is not the same as proving that it can live. Test flights, refinements, and milestones carried Concorde from the realm of ambition into the realm of operational possibility, but they did not erase the deeper issue. The airplane had been built to master physics, and in a profound sense it did. It solved the problem of sustained civil supersonic flight with a level of elegance that still commands admiration. But the success of the machine raised a harder question. What happens after the breakthrough, when the engineers have done their work and the airlines must decide whether this extraordinary object can make sense in the ordinary world of schedules, ticket prices, maintenance bills, and profit? Concorde had answered the language of speed with a masterpiece of compromise. Now it would have to answer the language of commerce, and those are not always the same thing. On January 21, 1976, the future stopped being a promise and became a timetable. On that day, Concorde entered scheduled passenger service, with British Airways launching flights from London Heathrow to Bahrain and Air France beginning service from Paris to Rio de Janeiro. The aircraft that had once looked almost too improbable to exist was now carrying paying passengers on real routes, in real weather, with real schedules to keep. The test program was over. The spectacle had begun. That first day mattered because Concorde was never just another airplane crossing into airline service. It arrived at a moment when commercial aviation was already changing the meaning of distance. The Boeing 747 was opening long-haul travel to far more people than ever before, turning the world larger in reach even as it became cheaper to cross. Concorde moved in the opposite direction. It did not democratize flight. It refined it, narrowed it, elevated it, and made speed itself feel exclusive. Where the jumbo jet promised abundance, Concorde promised distinction. For a machine built to fly at about Mach 2, the practical argument was simple: it saved time. But in the marketplace, time was only part of the story. Concorde sold something more elusive and perhaps more powerful. It sold access. It sold the sensation of slipping ahead of the normal rhythm of travel, of boarding not just an aircraft, but an event. To fly Concorde was to step into a version of aviation in which the flight was not merely a means of getting somewhere. The flight was the point. Its cabin reinforced that idea from the first moment. There were only about 100 seats, which meant the aircraft never felt anonymous in the way larger airliners did. The interior was narrow by comparison with the wide-body giants that were reshaping international travel, but that constraint became part of the mystique. Concorde's smallness was not experienced as a deficiency by its passengers. It was experienced as intimacy, as selectivity, as proof that they had entered a rarer class of travel. The service matched the aura, polished, deliberate, and styled to feel closer to a private club than a mass-market airline cabin. This was not just transport, it was theater with a departure gate. That performance mattered, because Concorde's image quickly became inseparable from the people who flew on it. Executives, celebrities, politicians, and other travelers with money or status to spare helped turn the aircraft into a moving emblem of modern prestige. The Concorde ticket was not merely expensive, it was legible. Anyone who saw it understood what it meant. The airplane said that its passengers had bought not only speed, but separation from the ordinary inconvenience of time. And yet the glamour was never purely decorative. Concorde was also a route machine, and its route map reveals how carefully it had to be fitted into the real world. The aircraft's first services were impressive, but the route that came to define it most powerfully was New York. London to New York became the essential Concorde corridor, commercially and symbolically alike, because it concentrated everything the airplane was built to do. It linked two financial capitals. It condensed a prestige transatlantic journey into a morning or afternoon. It made the abstract idea of supersonic travel concrete enough to sell. If Concorde had a single stage on which it became famous, it was this crossing of the Atlantic, where speed, business, and luxury converged into one highly visible routine. That visibility was crucial. The great contradiction of Concorde's success was that the aircraft became iconic precisely because it was not commonplace. Every flight confirmed the fantasy and the limit at once. A small number of passengers experienced the future firsthand, and everyone else saw the future rendered as a status symbol. Concorde was not hidden away as a laboratory curiosity. It was public, glamorous, and aspirational. People could read about it, photograph it, watch it taxi, and envy the people inside. The machine turned its own scarcity into value. But that very scarcity also framed the deeper truth that hovered beneath the champagne and the headlines. Concorde entered public life as a triumph, yet even at the height of its fame, it was already clear that it would not spread across airline fleets the way the 747 had. It was too specialized, too costly, too operationally constrained to become the standard answer to long-haul travel. It was loved not because it was ordinary, but because it was extraordinary. The world did not adopt Concorde in the way it had adopted the jet age. It admired it. That distinction mattered. Concorde's years of glory were not the years of mass expansion, but of proof. It proved that supersonic passenger flight could be made safe, regular, and publicly desirable. It proved that engineering ambition could be converted into a real service that people would pay for, year after year. And it proved something more subtle, that a machine can become more than a machine when it captures the imagination of an era. For a time, Concorde was not just flying between cities, it was flying above the compromises of the age. Yet even at that height, the boundaries were always present. The same qualities that made Concorde exceptional also kept it isolated. It was admired as a symbol because it was difficult to scale as a business. It was useful because it saved time, but it was precious because it could never be everywhere. That tension gave the aircraft its aura. It also marked the edges of its future. By the time Concorde had become a cultural icon, it had already settled into the role it would keep for the rest of its life. Beloved, famous, operationally proven, and permanently a part. The future had finally taken off. But it was taking off with only a handful of seats, on a narrow set of routes, under conditions no mass market could easily repeat. And that made the next question unavoidable. If Concorde had won the race for speed, why did so little of aviation seem built to follow it? Concorde's great paradox was that everything which made it astonishing also made it difficult to survive in the ordinary world of airlines. It was not simply a faster airplane. It was a machine built around a different idea of what aviation could be: fewer passengers, longer range, higher altitude, more prestige, more speed, and far less tolerance for compromise. That combination worked beautifully as a demonstration of national ambition and engineering skill. It worked less beautifully as a business model. The economics were unforgiving from the beginning. Concorde demanded enormous development spending, and the fleet that emerged was tiny. There was never going to be a vast global network of supersonic service to spread those costs across hundreds of airframes and dozens of routes. Instead, the aircraft had to earn its keep through a narrow strip of premium travel on a handful of city pairs, with fares high enough to justify an airplane that was expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and expensive to operate. That was not a temporary problem. It was built into the concept itself. Concorde was, in effect, a luxury product with airline-scale fixed costs. By the mid-1990s, that reality was visible even in the ticket price. A round-trip New York-London fare in 1996 was reported at $7,574, a sum that made the aircraft feel less like a transportation option than a statement of privilege. For some travelers, that was part of the appeal. The cabin was small, the service was carefully staged, and the whole experience carried the glamour of being admitted to a club defined by speed and exclusivity. But the very fact that Concorde could be marketed this way revealed the limit of its promise. It could be remarkable, or it could be mass market. It could not easily be both. Then there was the map problem. A conventional airliner becomes more useful as it can be deployed across more routes, more distances, more kinds of demand. Concorde ran into the opposite condition. Its speed depended on conditions that made overland operation politically and legally difficult, especially in the United States, where civil aircraft were barred from creating sonic booms over land. That restriction mattered more than a single rule on a page. It meant Concorde could not simply become a normal domestic aircraft, connecting cities deep inside continents the way subsonic jets did. It was pushed toward ocean crossings, where its speed could be used without disturbing people below. That made sense technically. Commercially, it was a cage. And then there was the atmosphere around the airplane itself. Concorde was admired, but it was also argued over almost from the start. Its noise footprint was conspicuous, especially on takeoff and landing, and its fuel burn was high compared with the efficient subsonic wide bodies that were transforming the market. Environmental criticism grew sharper over time, but even before it became a broader public issue, these practical concerns narrowed Concorde's room to maneuver. Airports had reasons to dislike it. Regulators had reasons to constrain it. The public could admire it while still resisting the idea that its extraordinary performance should come at an extraordinary collective cost. That mattered because the rest of aviation was moving in a different direction. In the 1970s and after, the wide-body subsonic jet changed expectations. Airlines discovered that they could move more people, more flexibly, at lower cost per seat, with aircraft that fit the economics of a much larger market. The industry's center of gravity shifted towards scale, frequency, and efficiency. For passengers, that meant more routes and more seats. For airlines, it meant more ways to fill them. Speed still mattered, but it mattered less than profitability, reliability, and the ability to serve a broad customer base. Concorde was headed the other way. Faster, yes, but narrower, rarer, and more dependent on elite demand. That is why so many early expressions of airline interest faded as the numbers became real. In the optimistic years of the project, Concorde had attracted attention from carriers that imagined some role in a supersonic future. But once the aircraft's limits were no longer theoretical, the enthusiasm drained away. The operating economics were too severe, the route restrictions too tight, and the market too small. In the end, only British Airways and Air France entered regular service with the airplane. That outcome was not just a corporate choice, it was a verdict on the size of the niche that Concorde could occupy. And yet calling Concorde a simple failure would miss what its operators eventually learned to do with it. In the hands of British Airways especially, the aircraft became something the original planners had only partly anticipated. A prestige machine that could generate value not by serving the most people, but by serving the right people. It became a symbol of arrival, a flying advertisement for speed, exclusivity, and technical distinction. That was a genuine commercial role, and in a narrow sense, it worked. Concorde made sense as a premium exception. It did not make sense as the future of everyday aviation. That distinction is the heart of the trap hidden inside the triumph. Concorde did not fail because it was unimpressive. It failed, if that is the right word, because it was too specialized to become ordinary. Its excellence was real, but it was not scalable. Every one of its advantages came with a cost that the broader airline market was increasingly unwilling to pay. It was a masterpiece designed to do one thing brilliantly, while the world around it was learning to reward airplanes that did many things acceptably well. So by the time Concorde had settled into its mature life, it was already living on borrowed time. It still crossed the Atlantic in a fraction of the usual hours. It still carried the aura of the future, but that future was shrinking around it. The aircraft was no longer leading aviation into a new age. It was defending a fragile exception, sustained by prestige, loyalty, and a stubborn willingness to pay for speed in a market that kept finding other priorities. The great machine was still flying. But the question was no longer whether it could conquer the world. It was whether the world was prepared to keep making room for it. And somewhere ahead, that question was about to become brutally concrete. On July 25, 2000, Concorde's story took a turn that no amount of glamour could soften. Air France Flight 4590 was a charter flight bound for New York, and it lifted off from Paris Charles de Gaulle, carrying 100 passengers and 9 crew. For a few moments, nothing about the departure suggested that one of aviation's most celebrated machines was about to become the center of one of its most devastating accidents. Then, almost immediately after takeoff, the chain began to unfold. What followed was not a simple failure, not a single explosive moment, but a sequence of events so fast that it denied everyone on board any meaningful chance of recovery. On the runway, the aircraft struck debris left behind by a preceding takeoff. That debris was enough to destroy a tire. Pieces of the tire were then thrown upward with enormous force, and one of those fragments damaged a fuel tank. Fuel escaped. Fire followed. The engine lost power. The aircraft, heavy and fast, and already committed to flight, was no longer just climbing. It was fighting to remain airborne while the left side of the airplane was being transformed into a furnace. This is what modern accident investigation reveals when it is working at its best. Not a lone villain, not a clean moral tale, but a chain of conditions, decisions, and vulnerabilities that converge in seconds. Concorde had always been an aircraft of narrow margins. It was built to be exacting, and it had spent its life being treated that way. But the accident at Gonesse exposed how dangerous it can be when a system designed for precision encounters something small, ordinary, and brutally unexpected. A piece of metal on the runway, a tire bursting under extreme speed, fuel igniting where it should never have been exposed, thrust disappearing when it was needed most. Each step was different from the one before, and each step made the next one harder to escape. At that point in flight, the airplane was effectively out of options. Concorde was already committed to the climb. It was still low, still close to the airport, but it had too much speed, too much damage, and too little time. The crew fought the aircraft as long as they could. Air France Flight 4590 crashed in Gonesse, a suburb north of Paris, killing everyone aboard and 4 people on the ground. The total human cost was 109 lives. Behind that number were families, colleagues, and the sudden rupture of ordinary life. For the public, the crash landed with a particular shock because Concorde had never been presented as ordinary. It was the opposite, a machine of prestige, ceremony, and mastery. It was supposed to represent the very peak of control. Watching it fail so catastrophically made the danger feel both exceptional and strangely intimate. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, and that too matters, because accidents of this scale are not understood by intuition alone. The French Accident Authority, the BEA, built its final report over many months and published it on January 16, 2002. Its work did what serious inquiry should do. It resisted the temptation to flatten the event into a single dramatic cause. The cause was not merely the debris, though the debris mattered. It was not merely the tire, though the tire failed in a catastrophic way. It was not merely the fuel tank, though the tank's vulnerability became fatal. It was the interaction among all of these elements and the larger environment in which Concorde had been operating for years. That broader environment had always been part of the aircraft's hidden story. Concorde had been admired for its speed, but that speed depended on a very specialized operating model. It flew only on a small number of routes. It required exact maintenance. It had long been understood as expensive to run and demanding to manage. None of that was new in 2000. What changed was the way those facts were seen. Before Gonesse, Concorde's limitations were often treated as the price of greatness. After Gonesse, they could look like warning signs that had finally become impossible to ignore. The aircraft was grounded after the crash, and the pause was not a formality. It was a reckoning. Engineers and regulators had to ask what it would mean to return Concorde to service at all, and what changes would be necessary to make that return defensible. The answer was substantial modification. The aircraft received structural and safety improvements, including changes intended to reduce the likelihood that a tire failure would again produce a fuel tank breach and fire. In other words, Concorde did not simply resume flying because people wanted it to. It came back only after being made, in effect, a different and more heavily protected version of itself. When service resumed, it did so under a cloud. The return was real, but it was not triumphant in the way a restoration of confidence would have been triumphant. The aircraft was still admired, still technically astonishing, still capable of crossing the Atlantic in the time it took most airliners to complete a meal service and a descent. Yet the public imagination had changed. The crash had punctured the sense that Concorde existed outside the normal logic of risk. It was no longer just a symbol of modernity, but a reminder that modernity can fail in a single violent instant. And beyond the emotional impact, the commercial world had changed too. Concorde had already been expensive to justify. The crash deepened the unease around a machine that was never easy to defend in strictly economic terms. Maintenance was costly. Route flexibility remained limited. Fuel burn was still high. The regulatory environment remained inhospitable to sonic booms over land, which meant the aircraft could not simply expand into new markets to recover lost confidence. The post-9/11's downturn would soon intensify the pressure further. Concorde survived the accident, but survival was not the same as recovery. The broader case for keeping it in service grew thinner, not thicker. What makes Gonesse so important in the Concorde story is that it changed the meaning of every compromise that had come before. The aircraft had always been a machine of trade-offs, and its admirers had long accepted that as the cost of transcendence. But after the crash, the trade-offs no longer seemed abstract. They had a face, a date, a runway, a fire, and a final report. They had a name that now carried grief instead of promise. Concorde flew again, but never in the same way. Its return was a reprieve, not a renewal. The airplane remained beautiful, fast, and technically singular. It still embodied an era when nations were willing to spend enormous sums to prove they could build something no one else could. But the crash at Gonesse revealed how fragile that bargain had always been. The aircraft that had once seemed to stand above ordinary aviation had been brought back to Earth by the same unforgiving rules that govern every machine. Materials fail, energy spreads, margins disappear, and time is often the one resource no crew can buy. From that day forward, Concorde carried a different burden. It was no longer only the future that had arrived early. It was also the future exposed. The question was no longer whether the airplane could still fly. It could. The question was whether anyone looking at it now could still believe that speed alone was enough to justify the risks, the cost, and the narrowness of the world it could inhabit. And once that question had been asked, the answer was already beginning to point somewhere else. After Gonesse, Concorde entered a quieter, lonelier season. The airplane still existed, and for a time it still flew, but the old confidence had gone out of the story. Every takeoff now carried the weight of scrutiny. The fleet was aging, maintenance became more demanding. Spare parts were harder to source. The economics that had always been fragile became harder to defend once demand softened and the world changed around it. The crash had not created every problem Concorde faced, but it had stripped away the illusion that those problems could be managed forever. Then came the post-9/11 downturn, and with it a harsher commercial climate for premium travel of every kind. A machine built to compress distance now lived in a world asking harder questions about cost, risk, and necessity. What made Concorde extraordinary had always made it vulnerable. It was too specialized to become ordinary. It flew beautifully, but it did so inside a narrow corridor of rules and compromises. It needed the ocean. It needed patience on the ground. It needed expensive care and a market willing to pay for speed as a luxury, not a utility. For years, that bargain had held together because Concorde was more than an aircraft. It was a national symbol, a political trophy, a flying advertisement for technical competence. But symbols do not balance maintenance budgets, prestige does not extend the life of an airframe, and when the commercial logic begins to thin, the romance has to carry a burden it was never designed to bear. The retirements came in sequence, and with them the final unwinding of the dream. Air France ended Concorde operations in May 2003. British Airways kept going a little longer, holding on to the type until October 24, 2003. That date marked not just the end of a fleet, but the end of an era in scheduled passenger flight. When the last commercial Concorde service crossed from New York's JFK to Heathrow, it was more than a route closing down. It was a farewell to a very specific belief that the future of aviation would be defined by ever faster travel for the few who could afford it. The aircraft had once embodied the certainty that the world would keep rewarding velocity. Now it was leaving the stage as the world chose differently. There was, inevitably, pageantry in the ending. Concorde had always been theatrical, and its departure from service was treated that way too. People who had spent years living with the airplane understood that they were watching something historic, but also something intimate. The final flights were not abstract. They were loud, visible, and emotional, carrying passengers who knew they were participating in the closing of a chapter that could never be reopened in quite the same form. The cabin that had once sold speed as elegance became, for one last time, a place where memory and spectacle fused together. The aircraft that had shrunk the Atlantic now seemed, in its own final moments, to enlarge time itself. Then came preservation, and with it a transformation Concorde had never known in service. Retired airliners are often scrapped, stripped for parts, or dispersed into obscurity. Concorde was different. Museums and heritage collections preserved it as a physical object of public memory. In that shift, the airplane changed category. It stopped being transport and became artifact. It could no longer carry passengers across an ocean, but it could carry a story across generations. Standing beneath its nose and delta wing, visitors were no longer looking at a product they could buy. They were looking at a canceled future that had actually happened. The machine remained real, but its meaning had moved into the past. That is part of why Concorde has never quite disappeared. It survives in photographs, in the silence around museum displays, in the remembered astonishment of those who flew it, and in the broader cultural image of an age that believed engineering could outrun compromise. It was not a fantasy. It was not a paper project or a beautiful impossibility. It was a working commercial aircraft that proved sustained supersonic passenger flight could be done. For nearly 3 decades, it crossed the Atlantic in a way no other airline had. That achievement matters. It should not be diminished by the fact that the business model never scaled. The airplane was real, and what it accomplished was real. But Concorde also proved something else. That making supersonic passenger travel routine is not just a question of building a faster airplane. It is a question of the world that airplane must live in. Noise regulation narrowed the map. Fuel burn raised the price of admission. Maintenance complexity narrowed the economics. Environmental concerns, once a secondary debate and later a central one, kept tightening the frame around what was politically and commercially acceptable. Concorde did not merely encounter limits, it exposed them. It showed that the future of aviation would not necessarily belong to the fastest machine available, but to the one that could fit inside a network of regulation, cost, public tolerance, and scale. That lesson has haunted every later supersonic ambition. New designers have not been able to ignore Concorde, they have had to answer it. NASA's work on low-boom supersonic flight treats Concorde as the benchmark, the first great commercial proof that passengers could cross oceans at twice the speed of sound, while also confronting the sonic boom problem that kept it confined mostly to transoceanic routes. In that sense, Concorde did not close the door on supersonic travel. It defined the terms on which the door might one day open again. Every modern proposal must explain how it will be quieter, cleaner, cheaper, or more acceptable than the aircraft that came before. So Concorde survives in a paradox. It died as a service, but not as an idea. It remains a standard of glamour, a warning about scale, and a reminder that technical success is not the same thing as commercial permanence. It taught aviation that the impossible can be built, and that building it is only the beginning. In the end, Concorde did not fail because it was a fantasy. It failed because it was real, magnificent, and bound by the world as it actually is.